Like, I'll be honest with you, I haven't been to an official church for years.
Caleb, this is hugely interesting to me. When I, produced my videos on this topic and put them on YouTube, I did not expect to hear this report, but I'm hearing it from all over the world. People who are
Mm.
telling me, "Yeah, I'm a serious Christian. I'll always be a serious Christian. But I haven't been to church in
Mm.
years. That just it's
Mm.
boring." Everything you said just perfectly summarized what thousands, tens of hundred, maybe millions
Mm.
of Christians are saying.
All right, g'day, folks. Today I've got a special guest with me, Dr. Tom Wadsworth, and he is a scholar. He recently has been making waves in the Christian community after 40 years of study and doctoral research into the Christian assemblies in the first century. He recently produced 7 YouTube videos, Why the Early Church Didn't Have Worship Services. Very interesting topic. These videos have attracted more than 500,000 views from more than 70 countries around the world. He is a professional speaker, writer, and biblical scholar who has 2 master's degrees, an MTH and a THM, and a PhD, all in New Testament. G'day, mate. How you going, Dr. Tom Wadsworth?
Yeah, good to talk to you, Caleb.
So, why don't we just begin by just getting you to give us a summary, according to your research, of what a church looked like in New Testament times.
Yeah, I think the maybe the first frame of reference we need to think about there is a house. It would be a mistake to think that they're meeting in some sort of sacred building of some kind. This much is clear. This much the New Testament testifies to many different times. So, if you want to think about a first century assembly, got to think of somebody sitting in a house, a small group. Clearly, you're not looking at a group of 150 people at all. Very few houses could handle something like that, much like our own houses today. Even back then, houses were even smaller than ours would be typically today. So it's just a smaller group sitting around very comfortably. There's no sense in which they feel like they're in a sacred building or that they need to dress up special in order to be at this holy place. There's none of that going on. It's
Mhm.
a more familial atmosphere where they're calling one another brothers and sisters, and they're feeling connected to each other. And so that's sort of the environment you're looking at. They're probably sitting down in comfortable chairs or maybe against the wall if there's just a few people or too many people there for everybody to sit. James chapter 2 talks about somebody needing to stand while other people might have the privilege of sitting.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you've got that kind of environment going on. And then, in terms of what takes place, I analyzed all of the verbs of speaking that are found in reference to Christian assemblies in the first century. And probably the most common word that refers to speech is teaching. The
Yeah.
typical kind of communication taking place is teaching. And it's not just
Hmm.
one person. You don't want to think of somebody standing at the front of the living room. You don't want to think of them dressed up in special garb or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
the guy down the street or some respected brother in Christ who is who's talking and doing some teaching. And then there's some give and take. There's more than one person doing the talking. This is an important principle as well. This also comes through
Yeah.
quite clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, which is the longest chapter in the Bible that talks specifically about Christian assemblies, what you're supposed to do. So you have that maybe is a good short summary of what's taking place. I could go into great detail there, but maybe that's
Yeah.
give that as
Good
a
start.
quick picture to think in mind.
Yeah, cool. That's good because we'll open up and expand on some of those as we go through these questions that I've got. So the next question would be, were there any church buildings in the New Testament? Did Christians meet in synagogues? Because often people talk about the early church in the New Testament times meeting in synagogues. or did they only meet in houses, according to the evidence we have from the New Testament?
Yeah, according to the evidence we have in the New Testament, the primary venue for meeting together is a house. That's mentioned so many different times. Even sometimes the name of the person who owns the house is identified. And even outside of that, there may be as many as a couple dozen references to Christian gatherings in homes. So with reference to the question of synagogues, I found this was strange, that I found several people responding to my videos on YouTube saying, oh, the Christians, they met in synagogues, and they always met on the Sabbath day.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. You look up the word synagogue in the Bible. I mean, you're only going to find it in the New Testament to begin with.
Yeah.
And you're going to find that, no, Christians didn't meet in synagogues. It is true that Paul did go into synagogues and make an effort to preach the gospel to this crowd of Jews who were accustomed to gathering on the Sabbath in the synagogue. He found this to be an ideal place to proclaim the gospel and to gain converts. But there is really no evidence that Christians met in synagogues. The synagogues were closely guarded and supervised by the Jews. There was leaders of the synagogues. There was officials involved with this, and for Christians just to come in and take over, it just didn't happen. Matter of fact, I don't see any evidence at all for the first 4 centuries that Christians went into synagogues.
4 centuries. Wow, really?
But the other side of that is that Paul definitely used the synagogue as usually his first opportunity, his first venue where he knew that he would be welcomed because he himself was a Jew. He also knew that there was a time in a typical synagogue agenda where they would welcome somebody to offer a word of exhortation. And Paul would say...
I thought that was really interesting in the book of Acts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Paul said, this is a great idea. This is perfect opening for me. And boy, do I have a word for you. And so he would stand up and then he would gain converts. And usually it appears that they would meet elsewhere. They'd find somebody's home and then gather there. So that's it's primarily home-based, certainly not exclusively so. And certainly Christians did not have sacred buildings. They did not have church buildings as we do today. But they're meeting in, and the place again is not mandated where. They could meet anywhere. They could meet in a synagogue if somebody would let them, but probably that would not have been the case.
Cool. One of the things that I often hear people say is they try to say that the only reason the early church met in people's homes is because of persecution, and they couldn't start up church buildings and so forth. In your research, do you find that to be true? Like, obviously you've researched the New Testament, but you've also researched, early church literature and so forth. Do you find any evidence to support that claim that the only reason they met in homes was to avoid persecution?
The short and quick answer is no. There's no evidence for that. I mean, I'm sure that there were cases when there was persecution going on in a given city, in a given climate, at a given time, when maybe the Christians would have found some refuge in somebody's home. But, even in Acts chapter 2, before persecution even begins, they're meeting from house to house. So they're not waiting for persecution to determine where they're going to meet. They're already going to houses. Acts chapter 5, it's mentioned again. They're meeting from house to house. And then even when persecution does happen in Acts chapter 8, Paul goes house to house to drag people out of their homes. So there's not necessarily any safety in a home.
That's a great point.
Now, they're meeting in homes because this was the natural thing to do. I think that this is just a guess on my part. Christianity was such that when people were converted, when they accepted Jesus, when they believed the gospel and became Christians, they immediately felt a kinship, a brotherhood with the other Christians, and there was this familial feeling among them, so that that they've just met with one another in homes. Another aspect of this is we sometimes think that they're meeting in a temple, but even Jews did not really have regular meetings in the temple, in a holy place.
Right.
There's another anachronistic error we typically make about thinking about the temple. The temple was a place where Christians would, or where Jews would go to pray, but usually praying individually. They would go at the ninth hour, or whatever the hour of prayer is, and they would drop down and appoint themselves toward the holy place and say their prayers, and then after the hour of prayer, they get up and go back to work. There's no evidence that there was leader-led prayer in the for Jews in the temple. Maybe once a year, or sometimes maybe the big feasts, there would be some gatherings in the temple of Jews. But when Christians met, they're not meeting in holy places. They don't even feel compelled to. I think they realized early on there was a fundamental teaching that went along with the gospel, that the temple is insignificant. And the Christians got that very early on. You see in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen gets up to speak to the Jews, there he talks about God does not live in temples. He's already speaking against the temple, and he's accused of speaking against the temple, as was Paul. They knew there was this inherent part of the gospel message that was anti-temple. And Jesus, of course, fulfills the very purpose of the temple. Jesus is the one sacrifice, and sacrificing was always done in a temple. So when the sacrifice is done, the once-for-all sacrifice, what's the need for a temple anymore? So there's more to that whole story, but that just explains why Christians felt no need to be meeting in a holy place, although they did initially. Now that's true. They stayed in the temple right, with the gospel preached on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. They're right there in the vicinity. It is the day of Pentecost, so there's a zillion Jews surrounding around the temple and in the temple grounds. And so if the first Christians are going to meet with everybody else, the temple grounds would be a great place to do it. Now, when you talk about meeting in the temple like they did, don't think in terms of Christians meeting in some covered building with rows and rows of pews and a pulpit at the front. None of that exists in the temple. It's open air, number one. The temple is a huge compound that is...
How big was it?
The best guess from archaeological sources, it's like 35 football fields.
Wow.
Now that's American football, but let's call it 35 soccer fields. Okay. Either way, it's huge, and it's so big they're not going to have a ceiling over this thing. And in the temple grounds, there would be commerce, there would be conversation. Some people would offer their prayers. There's discussions taking place in a normal temple activity outside of the Christians. And so it was a natural place for Christians to go to talk to one another and meet one another. But that quickly ended. I don't think you see any evidence of Christians meeting at the temple after Acts chapter 5.
It's interesting because when Jesus went to the temple as a boy, he was asking and answering questions. I wonder if that's kind of the format that church was. There was conversational style interaction rather than, like you said, this. But that's something maybe we'll get to when we get into the next section. That I wanted to talk about, but maybe we'll stick to the house churches a little bit so we don't go off track, and then we'll bring all those points up as we go along. So my next question is in James chapter 2 verse 2. There's and I don't speak Greek. I just look at the word that somebody's made this argument to me in the past, but it talks about an assembly. When somebody comes into your assembly, and the word assembly there is in the Greek like synagogue or something like that, and they try to say that that is evidence that they met in the synagogue. What do you think about that verse?
Yes, the Greek word there is synagoge, which is also the Greek word for synagogue. But
Yeah.
very few Christian scholars think that the word synagoge there in James 2:2 is referring to an actual synagogue. There's a few things you need to remember. The common Greek word that is used in the New Testament to refer to Christians gathering is synago. That's the verb form of synagoge. It means to
So
gather
that's the
together.
verb form of synagogue.
Yes. Soon, that
Yeah,
little
okay.
prefix means together or with, and then ago is the Greek word for to go or to come. So it's this
I
coming
see.
together, this going together that goes along with a Christian meeting. They come together. The place where they come together is a synagogue. And that
Right.
word
Yeah.
synago is used probably more frequently. It is used more frequently than any other word in the New Testament to refer to the gathering of Christians. And then there's one
Right.
other
Okay.
word in Hebrews 10:24 and 25, this famous verse that's often used to shame Christians for not going to church and not assembling
Hebrews,
yourselves together. Well,
yeah.
the Greek word
Yeah.
there is episunago,
Right.
episunagoge,
Yeah.
which is to come together in the same place. So the
Right.
point is,
Right.
it's likely there in James chapter 2 that James is using this term synagogue in its generic sense of a place of gathering. There in James 2, he also calls it your synagogue.
Right.
It's not the Jews' synagogue, but it's your gathering place. If somebody comes into your gathering place, and all
Right.
the other stuff, so that's the context in which it happens. That's more than likely what James is getting at by using that term there. It's the only time we see that word, and it, by the way, it has
Yeah.
baffled scholars for centuries as to why he would use that term. But remember, this is likely James, the brother of Jesus, who was also a major church leader in Jerusalem. He was considered to be maybe the focal point of Jewish Christianity in the first century. Highly revered, highly regarded by everybody in the first century. And he is the Jew of the Jews. And so there's a lot of evidence throughout the book of James that he uses a lot of Jewish language and terms that they would have recognized in that culture. And so synagogue is just another one of those. But here it probably means in a generic sense of your place of gathering.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So it doesn't have to refer to a specific building. It can just refer to a home or something like that where they've been regularly gathering together.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. I think you kind of answered this question. How many people do you think there were in a single house church? Is there any evidence anywhere? Obviously, the New Testament, the best we've got is the 120 in the upper room. Is there anything else outside of Scripture or in Scripture that would indicate how many people would meet in a home church?
And that 120 is a real good resource there, because I think it's the only time you see a number attached to it in even outside of the New Testament. You just don't see too many references to the numbers of people in a particular gathering. Now, I've had the good fortune to walk through the ruins at Ephesus, to go to Pompeii as well. Pompeii is a great place to visit because here you have a first century Greco-Roman city, and you can see what houses were like. You can actually walk into them to get an idea of the size of the courtyard or of the living space. And, typically fitting 120 in one of these places is really a stretch, but this upper room had to be a special upper room where you could fit that many people.
Could be like an outdoor entertainment area, like what we have, in Australia. We have like outdoor areas under, we call it a veranda. I don't know what what word you guys use, veranda or pergola or something. And there's an outdoor area you could fit more people. It could have been a bit like that in the upper room.
Exactly. I think that's right. You remember also Acts chapter 12. Peter is in jail, and a bunch of Christians are gathered at the house of Mary in Jerusalem, and they are praying for Peter. Well, he is released, and he comes to the house, and they're all surprised to see him. And then after he leaves, he says he's got to go to talk to the others. And so the idea is there's probably a whole bunch of other Christians who aren't at Mary's house, but are probably somebody else's house throughout the city. Because after all, in Acts chapter 2, there's 3,000 people who are baptized? There's hundreds of converts. Now, a lot of those probably were from people from outside of Jerusalem. But there's hundreds of people who are Christians in Jerusalem, and they're not all at Mary's house, but they're at other people's house. And so Peter goes to somebody else's house after that, and there'd be little sections around town where people would meet. They just knew where the common meeting place was, and so that's what you have. And so as far as numbers, you're lucky to get 20 to 40. 40 probably is what a number I've seen in early church archaeological studies. Not too much more than that, maybe a lot less too. Could have been under 10 even in some places, depending on how many converts they had in a given community.
Okay, interesting, cool. I did go when I was in Rome. I visited a place that had housed a home church, and they had these great big pillars, all the way through the building. There was no way you could have like a speaker out the front and like the congregation watching with pews or seated, because the pillars would block the view. There were just dozens of pillars, not just one or two main ones, but dozens of them inside of the room. It would have just been impossible to have a sermon type environment there.
Yeah, and let's speak about that for a second, Caleb. We want to think, when we see these things, we want to think in terms of modern church, and we force that into that first century setting, and we want to think of a preacher standing up and delivering a sermon. I think that the first century setting is substantially different, and I think we're going to get into that as we get going here.
Yeah, cool. So now the next question, that's the last one on the house church section, is a little bit complex for some people that haven't heard of the term, the regulative principle. And my question is this: do you think the regulative principle requires house churches, or do you think it's possible to consistently hold to the regulative principle and meet in large church buildings? Maybe you could just define the regulative principle for us as well.
Yeah, the regulative principle says that it's basically trying to distinguish between scriptures that are prescriptive and scriptures that are descriptive. In other words, when you have a prescriptive scripture, you're having a passage that is prescribing or commanding that for all time and all places, that things must be done just like this. That's a prescriptive verse. But then there are verses that are descriptive, that simply just describe what was taking place without any connotation that there's an expectation that Christians for all time in all places will do things in a particular way. Now, it turns out with a lot of the passages that talk about first century assemblies, most of them are descriptive. And the times you get into prescriptive matters regarding the assembly, you have Paul, like in 1 Corinthians 14, using the word oikodome, which means edification. That's one thing that is prescriptive, that is required, that all things that are done in the assembly must be done to build up one another. It's remarkable how much leniency Paul gives the Christians there at Corinth. Already their meetings are rather chaotic, and he wants them to be done decently and in order, for sure, as he says in verse 40 of that chapter. But the primary thing he's looking for is edifying one another. That if you're going to pray, make sure that other people understand what you've said so that they are edified by what. If you're going to sing a song, make sure people understand it so that they are edified. If you're going to speak in a tongue, make sure it is interpreted so that people are edified by that. No matter what you do, Paul says in verse 26, let all things be done for edification, oikodome. So that's the primary prescriptive issue that applies to the assembly. The magic of this idea that if you're just simply, no matter what culture you're in, no matter what continent you're sitting on, no matter who's in the room, no matter what period of time, you're talking about 1200 AD, 200 AD, 2200 AD, just strive to build up one another. And a lot of the other details will take care of themselves if you get that principle down to begin with.
Okay, cool. All right, so now we get into the next section of questions that I had. Actually, I did have one more question actually with the house churches. I just remembered on my list here. The New Testament talks about the school of Tyrannus as a meeting place that Paul met, and people say that that's an example of a church building in the New Testament. What's your thoughts on that?
I tend to think I wouldn't use the phrase church building. That's modern thinking, modern terminology, and we're trying to force that on the Hall of Tyrannus or the School of Tyrannus, however somebody wants to translate the Greek there. What it probably was, it was a meeting place that could be rented, perhaps. It could be that Tyrannus is the guy who owned it and thus rented it out as a meeting place or a lecture hall, if that's possibly what was going on there. And Paul uses it for his reasoning with the Jews. Or he goes to the Hall of Tyrannus because he's basically been kicked out of the synagogue. He had been teaching in the synagogue repeatedly for a long time before that becomes untenable. And then he moves to the Hall of Tyrannus and then continues doing this on a regular basis. I get the impression, reading from, this is Acts 19, verse 9, where you see the Hall of Tyrannus mentioned. I get the impression that he's using this venue as part of his evangelistic work in the community to be reasoning with people on a regular basis in this open air or this place that's open to the public. Anybody can go. And then he can teach and inform anybody about the basics of the gospel. I don't think that the Christians used it as a meeting place, although it's indeed possible. And there's certainly nothing that would be objectionable about Christians using it. They just probably have to pay for it because it sounds like go ahead.
It does. I think it does specifically say that he disputed with people in the school of Tyrannus.
Yes.
And I think as well that Paul, because that was in Ephesus, the school in Tyrannus, from memory, and Paul later on in Acts chapter 20, when he calls the elders of the church, he says, "I did not cease to warn you day and night for 3 years, from house to house and in public." He talks about, so there's the two places, there's the house to house and the public places where he warned them about false teachers. And so, my reasoning was that the school of Tyrannus was a place of where he publicly disputed with people, probably false teachers and so forth as well. And that was a public location, and he also taught them from house to house. That's kind of how I understood the school of Tyrannus, which seems to fit with what you're saying as well. So
now that's a very good verse to point out, Caleb. And that, by the way, he's talking to the Ephesian elders when he says, "I did not hesitate to teach from house to house and in public." And that is at Ephesus where the Hall of Tyrannus was. So it fits quite nicely with all of this line of thinking.
Yeah, cool. All right, so the next section here, moving on from house churches. In your lecture series, you've made, I think, quite an interesting statement, and I made a poll on this on my channel to see what people would think, although some people misunderstood the poll. But you've said that Christians, when they came together, they didn't come together to worship, they came together to fellowship or to edify one another, to build one another up. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because that's a very controversial statement. Everywhere I go, people seem to think that the purpose of coming together is to worship God, but you're saying that's not the purpose, at least not the main purpose.
Yeah. We have houses of worship. We have hours of worship that are usually posted on the sign outside the building. And then when the worship service begins, we open worship with something. And then at the end, we close worship with something. Sometimes we have a printed order of worship, and we'll sing worship songs, and we'll have acts of worship, and we'll make sure we're doing our worship acceptably. All this worship term, worship pastors, worship team, worship band, all this worship stuff that we use that language. But one thing that stunned me when I first stumbled on this was the New Testament never uses that language in reference to first century assemblies. The word worship is absent when in all these discussions about Christian assemblies. This stunned me when I stumbled on this 47 years ago in 1977. I was preaching through 1 Corinthians, and I came to chapter 14, and it talks about dealing with the assembly. That's the topic of the entire chapter. And I was stunned that when he pointed to the purpose of everything that is done, he didn't say the purpose of everything you do is to worship God. Never does he mention that. Neither does anybody else mention that. From Acts, or rather from Matthew through Revelation, it's just not there. And so that's what really motivated my entire doctoral dissertation, to do an extensive study of, number one, how scholars have dealt with this issue, and number two, how the New Testament deals with Christian assemblies and the language they used in reference to them. And number three, if they're not using these worship words in the New Testament to refer to what they're doing, why is that? And so I studied the 5 different Greek words that are translated as worship, and studied every time they're found in the New Testament as well as throughout the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, to find out what these words mean. And sure enough, they are never used to refer to what Christians did when they got together. And by the way, that continues on into the 2nd and the 3rd century too. They still don't use worship terminology to refer to what they're doing in their assemblies after the New Testament period, for the first couple hundred years. But these Greek words for worship are temple terms. They refer to what Jews did in the temple, like offering sacrifices and such, and other temple activities, which never applied to what Christians did when they got together. So that's one of the key reasons why you never see these terms used to refer to what Christians do when they got together.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Some people, they'll point to Romans chapter 5, where it talks about offering yourself as a living sacrifice, which is your acceptable worship. And they'll say, like, everything you do should be worship. And so why don't we worship when we come together? I know that's because laymen are speaking, that can kind of muddy the water a bit. But what would be your kind of response to that?
Yeah, that's Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. And that's the Greek word latreia, where Paul says, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, I beg you to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable latreia. That's the Greek word. Sometimes it's translated as worship, sometimes it's translated as service, but it's the Greek word latreia. And so my mission for my dissertation was to figure out, what does that word mean? And so I studied all the times it's found in the New Testament, and all the times it's in the Septuagint. And it's rather clear. This is a special term that refers to sacrificing, serving deity with sacrifice. It's always in reference, it's always a term used to something you do for deity, but it's specifically referring to offering sacrifice. And there in Romans 12, verse 1, Paul uses all this sacrificial language to offer. The word offer is a common sacrificial term. You offer sacrifices. That's the verb that's used there. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. There's the actual word for sacrifice right there. Holy and acceptable. And sacrifices in the Old Testament had to be holy and acceptable, which is your reasonable offering of sacrifice. He's not talking, it's problematic to translate it as worship, because in our culture, when we hear the word worship, we think of what we do in church, But that word
Yeah.
never did not refer to what Christians did when they were gathered together. There, what he's using
Yeah.
it in a figurative sense. And he's signaling to us that he's using it figuratively by putting this adjective logical or reasonable or spiritual. It's this Greek word logikane, which appears just before latreia there. He means to make us sure we understand we're not physically offering our body as a sacrifice. We're killing ourselves and splattering our blood upon an altar, but it's our reasonable or our spiritual sacrifice that we do by offering our bodies holy and acceptable to God, which is done by the renewal of our mind, the transforming and renewal of our mind to think of things differently and to live our lives for God.
And I guess as well, like that verse is not talking about something specific you do when you gather together. That's just talking about your life in general. Your life in general is to be a sacrifice to God. But what we're really discussing is what we do when we come together. And when we come together, we don't come together to offer a sacrifice. We don't come together to worship, like you're saying. We come together to edify one another and to build one another up and to fellowship, so that we walk away, as you've said in many times in your lectures, we walk away being a better Christian than what we were before. And in one sense, that is a sacrifice, isn't it? Because that's, great. Yeah, that's awesome. Now, next question. Now, I don't know if you had a chance to do this, but the next question is, can you take me through a few verses that describe what happened in a typical New Testament church?
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 14 is probably the best place to go because it's the longest chapter in the Bible that deals specifically with the issue of Christian assembly and what they did. There are a bunch of other passages we could look at as well, but they're all pretty consistent in pointing to building up one another as the purpose of everything they did. I think there are 14 different words used in 1 Corinthians 14 to refer to the different kinds of speech done. They are blessing, they are praying, they are prophesying, they are teaching, they're speaking in tongues, they are interpreting tongues. All these different, they're singing psalms, a word of knowledge. There's lots of different things taking place in a typical assembly with no particular order required. The only order that is required by Paul is that if somebody is going to speak in a tongue, in another language, it is required that right after that there be somebody interpreting what that person just said. Again, because the reason you do everything in the assembly is to build up one another. And if somebody is not edified by what you just said, they need to keep quiet. And Paul explicitly says so in 1 Corinthians 14. Now, another key fundamental event that was probably there with almost every assembly is the Lord's Supper. And that's referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, just a couple of chapters earlier. So they're having a meal together. Another thing that hit me when I was doing my doctoral research on the Lord's Supper, it finally dawned on me that the word supper means a supper. We use this little phrase, Lord's Supper, and we think of, there's a little piece of cracker and a little shot of juice, and that's your Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
No. Nobody in the first century would have thought of that. When they heard the word supper, they thought supper. It's the Greek word dapnon, which always means a supper. It's a meal. They were having a meal together. And we know that Christians did break bread from house to house. And breaking of bread is not just getting together and cracking open a loaf, but it's a euphemism for having meals together. And sometimes we still use that today. You want to break bread today? Let's go to a restaurant. And so that was common also in the first century, breaking bread and having meals together. And I sense that the way the Lord's Supper would have been observed in that culture is they would probably pause at the beginning of their meal together, like it's a church potluck almost, where they would maybe break bread. I mean, literally break a loaf of bread and pass it around, and let's remember what this loaf represents. It represents Jesus' body broken for all of us, and that we're all part of the body of Christ. And then when they would get to a glass of wine or whatever they're drinking, they would have raised the glass and say, this represents Christ's blood shed for us, and let's remember what that means for us. And so that was a part of the Lord's Supper. Paul specifically mentions in 1 Corinthians 11 that some people were abusing the Lord's Supper by going ahead and getting drunk and ignoring some other Christians there at that house who didn't have anything to eat. And that's just the opposite of what the Lord's Supper should be. You've got to be considerate of everybody. It's a loving, compassionate, one anothering kind of event where you got to be thinking about other people.
What do you think about that passage? I think it's in the book of Galatians where Peter is not eating with the Gentiles, he's only eating with the Jews, and Paul speaks about how he rebuked him. Do you think that was a moment where they were kind of gathered together and they were having the Lord's Supper, but they were kind of segregated or something? Do you think that's possible, or is that just something I just randomly, wrongly popped into my head?
No, that's pretty good. I actually hadn't thought about that occasion there in Galatians where Peter is dining with some Gentiles, but then some Jews come in and he immediately separates because he knows he's not supposed to be eating with Gentiles. But I think what that points out more, not so much anything about the Lord's Supper, but it points to the common gathering convention of having meals together. This was just part and parcel of being a Christian in the first century. You would break bread from house to house and be having meals together. This was just the Christian community. Yeah, interesting.
Now, another thing that you've said, which would be quite controversial in the church world, is you said that they didn't really have sermons in New Testament churches. Can you talk about that and just explain what it was like, what the teaching, because the Bible does talk about teaching and even the word preaching. I sent you a couple of verses that I was thinking of, 1 Timothy 4:13 and 2 Timothy 4 verse 1 to 2. Maybe you can somehow incorporate that into your response. But you're saying there was literally no sermons, in the New Testament during their gatherings and so forth.
Well, my point in making that statement, I think my statement was why they didn't preach sermons in the early church. Really trying to make a point about the terminology they used. They would not have used the terminology of somebody standing up and preaching in church. Preaching, the Greek words are kerusso and euangelizomai. These two terms are primarily used to refer to evangelistic activity. This is what, when Paul went into a synagogue, he would be proclaiming the gospel. Jesus, he's kerusso. He's also euangelizomai. He's also proclaiming the gospel. He's preaching the good news to people who have never heard it before. Preaching and proclamation is a communication strategy done before outsiders, not before Christians. The word sermon also is interesting to note here, that even though we use the word sermon repeatedly, the word sermon is not even found in the Bible. It's not even found in the Sermon on the Mount, which should blow your mind. Now, it might be in a little subhead that's been injected there by the publisher of the Bible, but it's not found in the text. So this is not to say that preaching sermons is somehow evil and you're going to go to hell if you do it. That's ridiculous. But it's just probably trying to make a point here. If we get back into using biblical terminology about Christian assemblies, we begin to get a better idea of the flavor of what's taking place. They are teaching one another. They are weighing what's going on. There's interaction in the assembly. It's not just one person standing up in somebody's living room and going on for 60 minutes or 40 minutes with a sermon that he's prepared, and then everybody can just sit there and shut up, and then you can leave when I'm done. This is a participatory gathering, that a point that is often missed, and I think our churches are weaker for it, because nobody in our modern church culture really has an opportunity to develop their ability as a speaker, as a communicator, as a teacher, as somebody who is encouraging other people, comforting other people with your words, whatever words you want to use there. We don't get that opportunity except to chit-chat about the football game before or after the service, right?
It's one of the reasons why I'll be honest with you, I haven't been to an official church for years. I just, there's no point in me going. Like, I go there, I listen to, we have some worship, but it's kind of like they're worshiping God, I'm worshiping God. The music's probably pretty rubbish. Then we have a sermon, and I'm just sitting there. The sermon's boring. I already know what the pastor's saying. I'm not learning anything new. Afterwards, I try to talk to people. If you talk about the Bible, people just walk away. It's just like, what's the point of going there? I would get more benefit out of just spending a couple of hours with my wife, asking questions about the Bible and talking about them and grabbing some commentaries and going through them and having a time of prayer. I get more out of that than I ever would going to church. So I haven't been to church for years, to be quite honest with you. I just gather with Christians, and we open up the Word and we have a great time of fellowship. But the Sunday service, I just don't see the point. I find it as a waste of time for me personally.
Caleb, this is hugely interesting to me. When I produced my videos on this topic and put them on YouTube, I did not expect to hear this report, but I'm hearing it from all over the world. People who are telling me, "Yeah, I'm a serious Christian. I'll always be a serious Christian. But I haven't been to church in years. That just it's boring." Everything you said just perfectly summarized what thousands, tens of hundreds, maybe millions of Christians are saying. And I think it's time for the church to wake up and smell the coffee here. People are exiting churches by droves. The numbers of people who are counted among church attendees today as compared with 10 years ago, 20, 30, is tremendously reduced, and it's on a downward trajectory that is not good for the future. For these traditional churches to try to survive, they're going to have to rethink what they're doing. And I think it was the COVID pandemic that forced a lot of churches to rethink what's going on, because they shut down, for months, wherever you are around the planet. And that forced a lot of people to rethink, why was I going in the first place? And now, I hear they're going to open up church finally this week. You going to go? This has been pretty nice. I don't really get anything out of that. It was something. I'll confess with you here, Caleb. Several years ago, I had my own son in one of my Bible classes that I was teaching. And he was probably 30 years old at the time, maybe 35. And he confessed, he says, I haven't gotten anything out of a sermon in at least 10 years. Whoa. And that blew me away, because I knew I was the preacher for some of those sermons. But he was just being honest. And, if I'm honest, I haven't got much out of a sermon in years, maybe decades as well, because I get it. I understand where you're going with this. All I got to do is see the sermon title and see the scripture it's based on. Okay, I got it. I know where you're going.
Yeah, that's right.
But what is vitally important to me is getting in a small group and having the opportunity for all of us to speak and to talk and to reflect on the scripture and to find out where everybody else is and the struggles that we have together, and to build one another up. And that's
Yeah.
the purpose of the assembly in the first place, and anymore, it's in the last place of what churches are doing. Because nobody gets to talk except for that guy who has prepared. We paid him to prepare that thing, by the way. We paid him to speak for 40 minutes. We even expect it, and there's a whole bunch of people who are going to criticize him if he goes less than the specified amount of time that we expect him to preach. So we're our own worst enemy here. We're causing our own demise of formal Christianity as we know it in the modern age. I don't know if we planned to go down that path, but frankly, Caleb, this is probably the most beneficial part of my research, is realizing what church was supposed to be and what it isn't anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Some people, they point to that passage in the book of Acts where Paul preached for a long time, and the guy fell out the window and died, and Paul prayed for him and raised him back up again. And it uses the word preach, and I had a quick look at it last night, and the word translated preach there, whenever you look at how it's translated elsewhere in the New Testament, it seems 90% of the time to be translated as reasoned or disputed. That seems to imply some sort of interaction rather than a sermon or a monologue. What's your thoughts on that particular passage in the book of Acts?
Yeah, the Greek word there is dialegomai. We get the word dialogue from it.
Right.
Reasoning together, dialoguing, talking back and forth. And it could be that Paul just went on really long that time. And believe me, if we want to have people fall asleep and die, we should do more long sermons. It's a great strategy. You can kill off a lot of members by doing that. And if it doesn't kill them off outright, they just probably won't come again if we want to keep doing that. But that's what's being done.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people so proud of themselves that they can preach for 40 minutes. I used to be the same kind of guy. Guilty, right here. Guilty.
Yeah.
But we're really not. Nah. What's a crime today is that all the talents, the spiritual gifts, the wisdom, the insight that resides in all the members sitting in those pews lies dormant. It never gets tapped in a typical church service today. But in the first century, they were there to build up one another. People were teaching. They were blessing one another. They were maybe singing, praying, different people speaking, engaging in one another, this dialegomai, this dialogue. And I don't want to miss that, frankly. If I can go into a group and have the freedom to speak and to listen to other people and hear the insights that they have, I don't want to miss that.
Exactly.
I have a few groups of people that I do that with, and I won't miss it. It's gold.
So I guess my next question then is, what is the role of elders in all of this? Because a lot of the time we tend to think that it's the role of elders to do all of the teaching, and that it's our role just to sit under his ministry. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, elders seem to be a key component of a typical ecclesia, a typical church in the first century. And yes, elders were supposed to be apt to teach. And I do get the impression that teaching was a key function of elders. But I also get the impression that there's a plurality of elders in each individual congregation. I also get the impression that not even the impression, it's clear that there was another role in the first century church called the teacher. The word teacher pops up a bunch of times in reference to churches having teachers as well as churches having elders. And it's probably one of the most common. I think it might even be used more than the word minister. But it's used a lot of times. So it's not as though elders are the only people who can teach. There are several people who can teach, but elders certainly should be among them because they're going to be selected primarily for their spiritual wisdom and leadership and guidance that they offer, and the thinking is that they would certainly be able to teach at the same time.
I was reading a verse at the end of, you mentioned it in one of your lectures, at the end of Hebrews chapter 5, and it talks about how at this point the recipients to the book of Hebrews should all be teachers by this point in their faith. I'll just read it, and I'll read a couple of verses and then just get your thoughts. So it says, Hebrews chapter 5, beginning of verse 12, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full of age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil." It seems to be saying here that every single Christian should reach a point of maturity where they can at the very least do some teaching. What do you think about that?
I think the point of the writer there is the Christians had not been progressing like they should. They were not growing up. They were not maturing like they should be. I don't think his point is that everybody needs to be a teacher, but because elsewhere you look at 1 Corinthians 12, I think some should be teachers. Ephesians 4, I think, also mentions some should be teachers. Some are prophets. Some are evangelists. Not everybody will be a teacher. I think it's also in, was it Romans 12 and 1 Peter 4, where it talks about, it basically aligns two different kinds of gifts, two different categories. One is a gift of serving, and one is the gift of teaching. So people are either going to have a speaking role that they're gifted at of some kind, or they're going to have a serving role. And in my experience, not everybody is gifted at teaching. Some people are naturally very shy, and they'd prefer to be a fly on the wall and be really quiet in a discussion. And they should not be feeling guilty about that.
Okay.
But I often find that when I'm able to get a person like that to open up and actually share what they're thinking, there's a lot going on there, and we have much to learn from those folks who are naturally shy. They're just, sometimes the people who want to talk all the time are people who are showboats, who are trying to get the attention. They just, they got to be in the spotlight all the time. And that's not necessarily good. There's something to be said about the humility that goes along with somebody who's being quiet. But certainly, the point of the writer in Hebrews 5 is that by this time, you guys ought to be teachers. There's an expectation that if you are a Christian for any length of time and have been going to these edifying gatherings every week for years, by this time, you ought to be advanced to much higher levels of spiritual use. Instead of just being a babe still. But I think the way our churches are organized today is that people could go to church and worship God for 50 years and get really, really good at worshiping God and still be a complete babe in Christ, not having advanced very far, never even having the opportunity to teach anybody anything. We've missed the boat there, and that's the problem. And I think there's a lot of people today, by this time they ought to be teachers. But the problem's not so much their fault. The problem is that the church has not organized itself in such a way so as to allow people to grow and to develop their abilities in teaching and speaking to one another.
Excellent. Let's see if I've got any more questions.
Well, while you're on that, Caleb, you're on there's one question you asked a little while ago that I didn't answer, and you wanted me to reflect on 1 Timothy 4:13.
Oh yes,
and 2 Timothy 4 verses 1 and 2. 1 Timothy 4:13 is Paul saying to Timothy, until I come, devote yourself to the reading of Scripture, anagnosis, which the word means the reading, to the paraklesis, to the exhortation, and then to the didaskalia, the teaching. So, sometimes those are not translated well and leads people to confusion. The word preach is not used there, although somebody might translate it that way. Paraklesis is exhortation. It's also parakaleo is to encourage other people, to urge, beseech them, that kind of thing. So he wants Timothy to devote himself to this paraklesis, to this exhortation in encouraging other people, as well as to teaching, as well as to the reading of Scripture. And then 2 Timothy 4 and verse 1. Here is a case where the word keruso, the word for preach, is used by Paul to refer to what Timothy should be devoting himself to. He says, preach the word, be urgent in season and out of season. And then he says, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. So I think there, when Paul says to Timothy to preach the word, he's talking about Timothy's role as an evangelist in the community, to be proclaiming and to be gaining converts outside of the assembly. And then when you can get them into the assembly, that's where you devote yourself to reading, to exhortation, and to teaching of the people who have become Christians. So
that's really
was
good.
Important
That's great. That's really good way to approach it. I think that's all of my questions that are answered here. Did you have anything else you want to add? Maybe if we could, maybe I could ask the question: how did the church develop from this, living room family environment where the teaching was interactive? How did it develop from that to what we have today, where we've got church buildings, sermons, pews, etc.? How did we get to that place?
This will take a couple minutes, but let's go ahead and do this, okay? You've got a couple minutes, right, Caleb?
Yeah. All
right, so the part of my mission over the last 40 years is to try to figure out why in the world the New Testament does not use worship terminology to refer to what Christians did when they got together. Why? And so it's clear I can answer that question from the New Testament text. But let's look outside the New Testament. Is it actually still true that worship language is not used to refer to what Christians did in their assemblies after the first century? And it is true, even in the second century, even in the third century. It's not until the fourth century that this happens. And so part of my research is I'm going through, there's like 2,500 times in the Apostolic Fathers and later Church Fathers that the word worship pops up. 2,500 times. And I'm studying all of them to figure out what's going on there. Are they referring to what Christians are doing in their assembly, or are they referring to something else? But as I went through all this study, I began to notice certain ideas began to pop up that were strange to me, that started to explain why this worship language was not used in reference to what Christians did when they got together. And that is, they were starting to use temple terms. Temple terms. And the first temple term that got to be used to refer to something that was happening in an assembly is the word sacrifice. And you start to see this really early in the beginning of the second century, where some Christian writers, again outside the New Testament, are calling the Lord's Supper our sacrifice that we offer to God. Now, to a typical Protestant mind, we know that's very strange, because we view the Lord's Supper as representing the sacrifice that Jesus gave for us. But now we start to see this idea in the second century where Christians are referring to the Lord's Supper as something, as our sacrifice that we give to God. Bizarre and strange, and it is. And it's not New Testament thinking. It's not Christian thinking. But one thing that starts to happen after that is once the Lord's Supper starts to be viewed as our sacrifice to God, then the table upon which the Lord's Supper sits begins to be viewed as an altar. And altars had no place in the Christian system of the first century. Altars was something that was in the Jewish temple. It was also in pagan temples. It was the thing upon which you offered sacrifices. But Christians don't offer sacrifices, of course. So they have no use for an altar. They don't even have sacred buildings. But now once you start to view the Lord's Supper as our sacrifice to God, then the table upon which it sits becomes an altar. This sacred altar upon which the sacred sacrifice is to be offered. Oh my. Okay, then the next stage of development starts to take place after that, where the person who presides over that table upon which the sacrifice is offered becomes a priest. And this is Old Testament thinking. This is Jewish thinking. This is pagan thinking, because pagans did the same thing in their temples. They had sacrifices. They had altars. They had priests. Jews had sacrifices, altars, and priests. But now the Christians are starting to adopt this Old Testament language to refer to what they're doing in their assemblies. As the Lord's Supper became this sacred big thing, and it also becomes miniaturized, it's no longer this full meal. It's now this sacred little holy Eucharist. And that changed its nature. It changed how people regarded it, and also changed how we looked at the people who are presiding over this. They're now priests. This is Old Testament language. This is not New Testament language. In the New Testament, we know that priests, well, all of us are priests. We're the holy priesthood. Everybody is. We're all holy, and not just some special few. And then the final fourth step of this four-step process was, if you have a sacrifice, and Christians started to view their Lord's Supper as a sacrifice, and if you have an altar, and if you have a priest who's presiding over that process, then the building in which all this takes place begins to be viewed as a temple. And there is a sermon, there I use the term, preached by Eusebius in the 4th century, around 320 AD, where Constantine had built the Christians this magnificent cathedral. And Eusebius, as a bishop of Caesarea, is given the task of dedicating this marvelous new structure. And he calls it a holy temple of God.
Yeah, wow.
So now the entire process is complete. Christians had reverted to Old Testament thinking of a sacrifice, an altar, a priest, and a temple. And when you have those things, you have the Greek idea and the Old Testament idea of latreia, sacrificing. This was involved, any sacrifice involved a priest and a temple and a sacrifice and a temple. So you've got all these things together with the concept of latreia. And from there, Christianity continued on with priestly ideas in reference to their special clergy, with referring to the Lord's Supper in special terms that it didn't have in the first century, and the altar concept and the idea of the church building as a holy place. Some of these ideas are not just in Catholicism or in Orthodox Christianity. They are there also in a lot of Protestant thinking as well. So the worship idea is still there because of all those things. What'd you say there? Say it again.
We have altar calls. You know, they say, "Welcome to the house of God," as if that house is the temple, of God where God dwells. Yeah, we have all that language. Yeah, it's very much the same. And then the person at the front is like a sacred, revered person who supposedly is closer to God than what we are. So he kind of like is a little bit closer to God than us. Just like the priest was an intermediary. It's almost a little bit like that as well. God speaks to him in a special way. Sometimes on the stage you say, "What was that, God?"
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely.
No, but the idea in the New Testament, we're all the holy ones. We're all saints. We're all priests. Nobody is more special than anybody else. All of us are endowed with the Spirit of God. All of us have something to offer to build up one another. But the modern church system has squelched everybody except for the few that we pay to do it, and they take care of the teaching process at the front. And that's fine for I was that guy, and I learned a lot by being forced to study for 10 hours every week and come up with something to say. But nobody else got the opportunity to study and to come up with something to say. And there could have been hundreds of people in my audiences over the years who could have developed into to teachers, pastors, leaders in various ways, but they never got the opportunity because our system won't let them.
Yeah, it's very sad state of affairs. Hopefully things change, and maybe we can just end by perhaps just giving some advice on, like, if there's people out there that don't haven't been to church, like you said, for a long time, what kind of advice would you give them?
Do what Caleb did. He found a group of people that he can meet with and study the Bible with and reflect on Christian living with. Do it on a regular basis. It's very simple. This doesn't take. You don't need to have a master's degree or even any kind of degree. If you can read, if you can talk, if you can think, Christianity is for you, man. The gospel is for all. It's not just for a select few. Everybody can reflect on this. It's remarkable, Caleb. The ability that you have. You've already impressed me with your Bible knowledge. You're working your way around scriptures. You know these things, and yet you haven't been to church in years. Yeah. But your commitment has not been not flagged at all. You're doing just fine. And there are thousands and thousands of Christians who are just like you. But I think we need each other. We need to grow in relationship to one another. That way we make sure we don't fall by the wayside. We don't give up the fight, that we stay with it to the end. And we need to have an influence on other people too. We can't just give it up. So find other people. And find them in a church, but break it into a group. One of the suggestions I have to anybody anywhere is to break big groups into small groups, because it's in the small group setting where you have the opportunity to speak, to ask questions, to express yourself, to encourage other people, to get outside of your shell, and to enact this one anothering that should be taking place in any congregation on the planet. One anothering is another key word that pops in with all this Christian assembly activity. You comfort one another. You pray for one another. You confess your sins to one another. You encourage one another. All this is biblical language used repeatedly over and over again, and yet we don't have that opportunity. But once we get that going, you're going to grow.
That's when your lectures really hit me, when I listened to the point about the one anothering. I think that's when it really hit me, because I've had people object and say, well, we do all of those things like outside of church, But then I was like, yes, but that's the point of meeting together. It's the point of the actual gathering is to do those things. If you have to do them outside of the gathering, then you're not really gathering for the right reasons. It's been great to have you. I really appreciate you. We'll have to get you back on as well. This is an excellent topic, something that's been close to me. So I was really happy to listen to your lectures and to hear about your stuff. It's really incredible, and I hope you get more traction, and I hope other YouTubers take you on for an interview, and you get more and more people interested in this, because I think it's a huge deal. I think it's a really big issue. So thanks a lot.
You might be encouraged to know my YouTube videos just exploded in the last few months, and there's over 500,000 views, I think, as you mentioned earlier on, and I'm getting comments from all over the place. But I'm able on YouTube, I can slice and dice the statistics to see where people are tuning in from. And 2 of the top 6 cities that are viewing my stuff are Melbourne and Sydney, Australia.
Wow.
Australia, there's a real hunger for this in Australia, and I've also noted that Australia has a, an active house church movement going on.
Okay.
It's hard to find it because house churches, almost by necessity, are under the radar, but they're
Mm.
out there. And I encourage
Mm.
anybody listening anywhere, find a small group of people. It may be a house church, it may be just a small group of people at a big church somewhere that you can meet with.
Yeah, cool. Excellent. Well, thanks for coming on. I'm going to end the recording, but we'll just quickly stay on to chat afterwards. So let me end it here.